Okay. So, can you see what I've put up? Okay, good. Um, so, I want to jump back a little bit today and pick up on some things that we passed over, but I wanted to add a little more detail to some of those things. And the first thing is this verse in Genesis 3, verse 15, very famous verse, especially for evangelicalism and evangelical theology, and the idea of the Old Testament foreshadowing the coming of the Christ. And this particular verse has often been viewed as, in some way, making the first comment in Scripture that has some possible indirect or direct connection to what happens later, much later in history. And as you may know, this is often called the proto evangelion, meaning the first gospel or the first thing that's said in Scripture that has some connection to the gospel. And this is where the where God is punishing the serpent. After he leads and tempts the man and the woman to disobey and eat the forbidden fruit. Then later on, he punishes each one of the parties. And so he gives this statement to the serpent that as time goes forth, there will be this hostility that will continue between the serpent and the woman. And also, not just you and her, but uh, all of your descendants or seed, it says literally, but all of those and all of hers. So that the human race and all that follow you in terms of bringing about temptation or whatever work um, is related to the uh, satanic or demonic world, and whatever people are influenced by that and try to cause others to turn from God, that there will be this ongoing tension, this ongoing conflict between those that operate like the serpent and those that are the children of this woman, all human beings. Often, however, some translations are a little bit inaccurate here, I think, because what I'm showing here is that when he talks about the fact that her seed, something in her lineage, will um, will crush his head, but he will still uh, somehow bruise or injure uh, the heel of this person or of humanity. But what's notable here is that uh, the Hebrew words are different. In the English translation, when you read that he will crush um, and the other one will strike him, you would expect two different words. And often the translations have different words here. Um, but the it's the same word in each instance. So there isn't much reason to translate them differently. the word that's being used basically means to injure or bruise or yeah, injure, hurt in some way, to strike this person. But crush, of course, is a very different idea than just bruising someone or injuring them. It implies complete devastation, but it's the same word used for what he will do, to this person. So, of course, it wouldn't work to say both are going to be crushed. So that's not really the idea. Some way in which um, the offspring of the woman will bring injury to the head of the snake, and the snake will in some way bring injury, will somehow bruise his heel. Now, what's distinct here, of course, is the object of the injury. It's the serpent's head that will be um, struck, but it's the human person's heel struck. And that's where the difference comes. Um, a head wound isn't always, but typically would be much more serious than an injury to your feet. So the verbs aren't really emphasizing crush as uh, compared or contrasted to just injuring. There's going to be mutual damage either way, but the serpent will be injured on the head, which suggests or implies a more serious injury. But that doesn't really uh, uh, allow the translator to change the meaning of the verb. So each one is going to be shuf. The Hebrew word is shuf, basically means bruise. So they're going to shuf each other, but the serpent's going to have a head injury, and so he gets, as it implies, um, the worst end of the outcome. So there's a hint resident in these words about an ongoing conflict between humans and um, and the powers that want to turn humans from following God and His commands. But at some point, there's going to be a human entity that will strike those kinds of people or the leader of those kinds of people on the head and bring serious injury or bring an end to his activities. But in doing that, this human entity will also be bruised in some way. He will be injured. In This is often seen as the first time there's any hint of what we know from a relation can be explained in terms of the mystery of Christ as the Messiah and his defeat of satanic or the serpent's work among humanity to lead them into disobedience. It's unlikely that Moses or whoever wrote this had that in mind, but they and no people in ancient times or even any Jewish Testament has ever read this and thought that it had something to do with what we see it as Christians, but that's how we can apply it. The author simply understands that there's going to be ongoing conflict between humanity and serpent type forces that try to lead humanity astray, that tempt humanity to disobey. And but there's going to be an outcome where the serpent or the powers that try to lead people from God will sustain some kind of defeat. So there's this forward-looking sense of that kind of battle going on throughout the rest of history. And of course, the details of it weren't known then, but of course, we know them now from fuller revelation through the New Testament and our experiences in church history. So that's what's going on with that verse. But I wanted to draw your attention to the fact that even though translations have this crush and strike difference, the Hebrew verb is actually the same. So it's better if translations stay consistent with that. Some people, even because it talks about the serpent being hit on the head, they try to tie that to the place where Jesus was crucified on Golgotha, which of course was a hill that got its name based on the fact that it was thought to look something like a skull. So you could see a connection between this head and um, and the crushing or the hitting over the head. However, of course, in this case, the head is the serpent's head, and so it doesn't quite work to make it mean Golgotha because this head belongs to the serpent, and it isn't part of the um, human person's situation when he strikes back and hits the serpent on the head, but he himself is wounded in some way. Um, so it's easy to kind of read ideas in the text because we stand at a long end of lots of revelation that people didn't have in earlier times. So one of our challenges um, is to always try to only make a text mean or let it mean what it actually says in its own context and not try to take back ideas in an anachronistic way and put them in the mind of people that wouldn't really be thinking those uh, specific things at that time. There is, of course, because of the way history is worked out and the later revelation, we can make parallels and we can see implications in text and ways they can be applied. But the exegesis of a text needs to stay strictly in terms of what the author was communicating and what his audience would have understood. That's on the exegetical level. But of course, there's more to scripture than just the historical contextual meaning. There is also the application and the meaning for us in the day and age when we live. But it's good to keep those separate and not read things in the text that aren't specifically stated. Um, so this serpent was condemned in this passage to crawl, which makes some people think he must have already had legs, and God, in a sense, took his legs away. I'm not sure that's implied. Snake's already crawled, so he's just commenting on the fact that you'll just keep on crawling, but you'll be engaged in this warfare. But naturally, the serpent is symbolic of more than just a physical snake, anyway. But he's going to be engaged in trying to get the human um, humanity off course spiritually. Actually, in Judaism, uh, when you look at how they try to um, talk about such a verse, uh, they take the seed of the woman as simply a way to talk about humanity. So this is just all of humanity. It's not a particular person. And either doesn't really change its messianic implications, whether the focus is on he doing something, which of course ultimately becomes Jesus, or he or it, in as you see here in the Hebrew language, he and it are the same words. Uh, so the third masculine singular pronoun can be translated he or it. It just depends on what you think the author is emphasizing. So whether it's it as humanity, that of course includes what the Messiah does, or it's specifically thinking of a he in terms of one human, the theological application remains the same. But for the Jews, um, for them and the way they understand uh, what goes on after this, they would say the seed of the woman is just humanity. That's not necessarily wrong. Um, and if you say that, it still doesn't take away the messianic application anyway. Some early translations had some interesting differences. The Latin translation, what's in the Vulgate, and what's called the Douay version. In the Vulgate English version, there's the Douay part, that's the Old Testament translation in English, and then there's the Reims part that is the English translation of the New Testament. So you see that volume often called the Douay Reims version, but it's based on translating the Latin of the Vulgate. And when that's translated into English, you get the translation. If you look back in the Vulgate and its English translation, it says, I will put enmities, not singular, but plural. I will put enmities between you and the woman, and your seed and her seed. And then it says, she will crush her head, and you will lie in wait for her heel. So they, for whatever reasons, read the text that way. There is, of course, statements in there about her, fem, fem, feminine singular words about her, the woman, of course, who is the first woman in the context. So they read it that what's being prophesied is that this woman would would crush the snake's head, and and so he would just be laying there waiting for her heel to finish him off. And of course, a lot of Catholic theology related to Mary and so forth gets related to this. But that's the translation that they work from. One translator um, argued that the difference, and this could be an explanation, uh, but it's hard to prove. He takes the approach that the reason for the different words, well, the different translations and how one word could have two different, really different usages in the same sentence. Um, he argues that it's a literary feature that allows the same word to have different meanings because they're connected to different things. And that's somewhat what I was indicating before. Even though the verb both times is to bruise, in one case, you're bruising the head, but in another case, you're bruising the heel. And the head would, of course, in most cases or many cases, bruising a head would be more serious than just bruising a heel. So you could try to assume that the author was trying to use that literary device and his audience would catch that. But like I say, whether he was trying to do it or not, uh, even though both verbs are talking about bruising, there is still the reality that what is bruised is different, the head or the heel. So that does make a difference in the ultimate interpretation and application. Also in Judaism, um, these they saw these different groups of the seed of the woman as distinct from the seed of the serpent. And of course, they see these as plural in implication, so that a group, even though the word group is singular morphologically, a group refers to a plural idea. There's a lot of people in a group. So they speak of the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent as talking about a whole group of people, not just one person or one woman. There's also a Jewish tradition about the Messiah. Um, and it said that the Messiah would be a remedy for the bruising of the heel of the woman's seed. So the woman's seed, the subsequent humanity, is damaged by this unspiritual influence, but the Messiah would come and he would be a remedy for this spiritual damage. So that's one Jewish tradition that ties this to the Messiah in that way. But you would think by saying that it would be not too hard to see Jesus as that remedy. But of course, there's a lot of historical and other types of baggage that go along with the history of the Jewish people that connects to why it's difficult for them um, to take on the Christian message. In the Christian world, uh, going back to what I said before, one scholar speaks of this proto-evangelium as just the first glimmer of the gospel. So as you can see, it's not in a direct sense actually predicting or prophesying the gospel from the standpoint of the author's perspective and what his audience could understand. But again, by looking back at this and the implications and applications, it has this um, idea in it that we see connections to what we know more fully as the gospel message. Another Christian scholar emphasized the importance of the redemptive promise that's included in the curse. And in church history, the identification of this seed of the woman with Jesus goes back at least as far as Irenaeus, around 180 AD, or um, CE, as it's more acceptable now to say the Common Era. And so when you see more recent publications, people no longer say BC and AD, they say BCE, before the Common Era, and then CE, the Common Era. Either way, in this AD or Common Era, around 180, we would date Irenaeus, and he's the earliest uh, person we know that talks about the seed of the woman here being connected to Jesus. And other church fathers as well uh, talked about this passage as the first messianic prophecy in the Old Testament. And it's been looked that way, at that way ever since. Um, and this also connects to the whole area of interpreting the Old Testament and then connecting it to Jesus or the church or other things in terms of making sense out of the passage, in terms of what the author's talking about, and then how the New Testament user of that passage is making application of the text. So, the significant area of discussion these days is what we call the New Testament use of the Old Testament. Uh, but when we get into the first century and the Jewish world and Jewish interpretation, we find that what was really the main type of interpretation going on then, and what was most popular, was not literal interpretation, but or exegesis, not contextual exegesis. They were mainly interested in how a text had meaning for them at that time. So they were focused on what we might call spiritual meanings or applications when they went to texts and thought about what do they mean. They didn't often, as we do today, talk so much about, well, what is the historical, literary, cultural context so that we can draw out what the author had in mind and what his audience would understand. Um, that was not the main concern in the first century among the Jews and among those who were teaching them. What that means is that um, that has significance when we remember that the first followers of Jesus and the people in the New Testament, for the most part, who do this kind of commentary when they go back to a passage, like Matthew going back to Hosea 11 and saying, Jesus fulfilled this. They were doing that as people who had grown up as Jews and had been trained as Jews in how to understand the Hebrew Bible. And their rabbis had modeled for them most of the time this practice of finding how the text was applicable, how it was relevant to their life at that time. So the types of interpretations that were given were spiritual and applicational, and what we would call today, in an exegetical sense, we would call it out of context, that it's taken out of its context and then it's applied to something. And the difference between that time and our time is that we now live in an age where taking something out of context is not considered legitimate. And that affects how we look at scripture. Uh, if someone takes words you say and they use them in a way you didn't intend, and it's embarrassing to you, you would complain and say, "Wait a minute, um, that's not what I meant. You took my words out of their context." We see that lots of times with politicians and people in the news when they're accused of something, um, or something is said about something they said that they don't agree with, then they'll immediately say, "Well, you took my words out of context, so your criticism of me is not legitimate." But and so we think of that as something that's not a good thing to do. But when we come to the New Testament, we enter into a world where interpretation by taking things out of context was normal, and it wasn't negative at all because it was done from the standpoint of making a spiritual or a theological application of a text, which is what they were most concerned about. How does this text have relevance for me today? So, what that has led to is that in the current world, Jewish scholars and Jewish people will look at the way we uh, and the New Testament go back to Old Testament passages and say, this Jesus fulfilled this. Just like Matthew said, the in Hosea 11, the Israel going to and from Egypt, that Jesus fulfilled that. And so, what they'll say is, you can't take things out of context because Hosea, for example, was talking about Israel. So if you say he's talking about Jesus, then you're just manipulating his words. And from our standpoint, we tend to go to the extreme of saying, well, it's prophecy. So Hosea was talking about Jesus, even though he didn't mention Jesus. Um, but all that's easily remedied when we realize that both things are true. Uh, Hosea has this passage in which he talks about Israel as having uh, been in Egypt, and then God delivered them to Egypt. And Egypt and Israel there is called God's son. And of course, for us, that naturally has a connection to the idea of Jesus as God's son. But in the context, it's Israel, the nation of Israel, that Hosea is talking about. And we know that because after he says that Israel is God's son, but God loved his son and he brought him out of Egypt. And that's where Matthew takes some wording. He says that just like Hosea says, out of Egypt I called my son. And then he says this has relevance to Jesus as God's son because Jesus uh, on the one hand, is being uh, said to be God's son and claimed to be God's son. And he also went to Egypt and came back, just like Israel did. So both things are true. That Hosea talks about Israel, and we also know that's true because after that first statement about Israel coming out of Egypt that Matthew uses, the very next statement is that this son still became an idolater. Even though God loved him and brought him out of Egypt, he still went back to serving idols. So, if the son in Hosea 1 is Jesus from Hosea's standpoint, then that means that in verse 2, Hosea is saying that this Jesus committed idolatry. But of course, he's not doing that. He's talking about Israel. Israel was God's son. He was in Egypt. God loved him and rescued him from Egypt. And but still, he paid God back with rebellion. From Matthew's standpoint, as someone living in New Testament times and being Jewish and being acquainted with Jewish hermeneutics and Jewish interpretation, as was most popular and was going on at that time in the synagogues and so forth, um, he does the same thing that the other Jewish rabbis and teachers do with the Old Testament. He makes an application, he makes a spiritual, theological use of the text. He doesn't exegete it because then he can only talk about Israel, because Israel's what the context is about. But from his perspective, the Messiah would have these kinds of experiences that would parallel Israel. And so here's the case when, just like Israel went to Egypt and came back and was considered God's son, now here's Jesus, who we believe is the Messiah. And he, like Israel, went to Egypt and came back. And he also is God's son. So Hosea is making that kind of parallel. That's a spiritual meaning, a theological meaning, not a contextual meaning. If you were to ask Matthew, well, who was Hosea talking about? He would say, well, Israel, of course. It's right there in the verse. It's what he says, Israel, my son. It's not symbolic for something. That's what's going on historically. But then if you ask him, well, then why do you make an interpretation about it being Jesus? He'd say, because that's what I'm doing. I'm making an application. I'm making a theological, spiritual use of the text that's legitimate. I can take it out of context because that's done all the time in our world. And so no one would have um, thought that weird or negative like we would today. And people were used to this. So um, Matthew's strategy, as we might expect, he's trying to convince Jewish people that this Jesus is the Messiah and that that can be demonstrated in various ways from their own Hebrew Bible. And things like this, where what's happening to Israel is also happening to Jesus. And so his strategy is to interpret scripture the exact same way that they uh, are familiar with, which is, of course, what you would want to do. If you're going to try to convince these people that your interpretation that Jesus Messiah is correct and that the Hebrew Bible points to this, then you have to do it in a way that they understand. And that's what they understood in their day, that these types of indirect and um, applicational meanings of a text is normal. And so he's just doing the same thing they do all the time. And of course that makes it such that they cannot say to him, now wait a minute, you're just twisting the scripture around. You're just putting ideas in there that isn't in the context. Um, you're just being creative and inventive because that's what their teachers were doing all the time with these scriptures. And Matthew does the same thing with which they're familiar. So it would make perfect sense to them that that was a legitimate way to use these scriptures. Now, whether or not they would ultimately choose to follow Jesus and Messiah, that involves a lot of issues more than just interpreting a verse or applying in a verse. There's all kind of cultural and personal and other issues involved in why one Jew would follow Christ and another Jew would not. But this is how this makes sense. Matthew's taking it out of context. And so uh, Hosea's text stands as it is, a statement about historically about Israel rebelling against God even after he was delivered from Egypt. And Matthew's statement stands true as a spiritual application in that Jesus as Messiah is paralleling, reliving, reenacting something in Israelite history. Um, and what's ironic is that for many Jews today, when they look at our commentary, where we go back to a passage like this or one like Isaiah 7:14 and say, "Oh, look, the prophet predicted that there would be uh, Jesus going to Egypt, and the prophet predicted this set of events in Isaiah 7 and all the other possible passages in a psalm, for example. They say, oh, the author of Psalm 2 predicted. And they would say, well, that's wrong exegetically because they aren't predicting anything. They're talking about things as they are. Uh, and then we try to explain it by saying, well, of course, it's a hidden meaning or something like that. Well, that doesn't really convince them of anything. And it shouldn't because that's not what's going on. There's no hidden meaning. Hosea is saying what he's saying, and it makes perfect sense to Jews at his point in history. And Matthew's saying what he's saying by using a spiritual application, and that makes perfect sense to the Jews in the first century. Um, at least his argument makes perfect sense. Whether they want to follow Jesus is another question. So, uh, the if you were to ask Isaiah or Hosea and other people in most of these situations about their prediction, they'd say, "What prediction? I wasn't predicting anything. I was just prophesying, and I was talking about Israel." So what happens is that Jewish people today will look at our explanation and say, well, Matthew, and then you're following Matthew in it. you're just taking things out of context and making them mean what they didn't mean at that time. So Hosea is talking about Israel, but you're just taking it out of context, and Matthew took it out of context. And so Matthew and you, all you Christians, are just twisting the scripture to fit your theology. And that's how they look at it. And what's ironic is it's Jewish history and Jewish interpretation that developed all this spiritual theological use. All that this out of context use of these scriptures came from the Jewish rabbis of the first century. And yet Jewish people now think of it more scientifically. Uh, so the challenge is to help them understand that we're not misusing the text. We aren't twisting the text. Matthew isn't saying that Hosea had Jesus in mind. He's saying that what Hosea was talking about is being reenacted by Jesus, and it's partial evidence of his messiahship. So that's what's going on when these passages are being used. They are being, in most cases, taken out of context, but that's not a problem because that was what was done in the first century, and it's what Matthew and others were doing, uh, just to fit right in with the way interpretation was being done at that time. Uh, so in our modern world, though, with our emphasis on it being improper to take something out of context, we have a hard time relating to this. And so we've tended to uh, make things predictions that are really prophecies. And it can creates problems um, because of the way uh, what we're saying doesn't fit the context. For example, like when Hosea says that this person he's talking about became an idolater. If you're going to say he's talking about Jesus, then Jesus became an idolater. You can't have it both ways. But he can say that because he's not talking about Jesus. He's talking about Israel. Matthew's talking about Jesus. And Matthew's not saying that Hosea was specifically thinking about Jesus, but that what Matthew does say is applicable to Jesus. And it's applicable in a very legitimate way, in the way that scripture was interpreted in the first century. And all people in the first century would have understood this very easily. So, having said all that, let me stop and ask if there's a question. Okay, you have a question?
Yes, of course. Thank you so much for your nice presentation.
Uh-huh.
I have one question. How how can the audience can understand the, the theological meaning of Genesis 3 and 15 on that time? Even even the Matthew or not Matthew, even the prophets also, as you said, they were quoting. There was a misunderstanding, as you say, with Jesus and the people of Israel. So
Mhm.
let alone them. So in the beginning, how this issue is related with the Christ, let it not be the Christ, but regarding the issue of spirituality, how they can understand this point,
Mm.
the Genesis point.
Yeah, you're talking about the audience that
Yes, of course. Yes,
that Moses was addressing.
yes, of course. The Moses
Okay.
and even the Moses was talking for the
Uh-huh.
audience. So how
Right.
that audience can understand the spirituality of these
Mm.
the seed and the syrup, as you said.
Mhm.
It's a symbolic, you say.
Right.
So how can they understand that point?
Um, well, I don't know that they didn't think of it symbolically. Um, I think from their standpoint, um, when they heard Moses say these words, they understand him talking about that there's going to be this hostility, between the serpent. The serpent, as I said before, in ancient uh, religions and thinking, is always a symbol of or a creature that causes um, chaos and disorder, and breaks up order and causes confusion. Uh, so they would understand that um, uh, people being influenced by some chaos creature is what happens in life, and that there would be this ongoing situation for humanity, always in some way being influenced by these serpent type forces. And of course, people at that time were quite aware of uh, a lot of what people in the other religions believed, and how they talked about sea serpents, and they also had serpents in their stories that caused chaos and trouble. And so the author of Genesis uses that same image. Um, so they would understand that as speaking about some force that's bringing about confusion and disorder and things like that. And so this is going to continue throughout humanity's history. But there's going to be some point at which uh, some human, or one human, or some kind of human force would uh, bring injury on the head of this chaos creature. And that would have, of course, suggest serious injury, most likely, but also the humanity, or a particular person in humanity, would also be, injured, be damaged in bringing this strike upon the serpent. Uh, so they would understand that things, are going to play out like that in some way, throughout human history. Um, there's going, a struggle between what we might say good and evil, struggle between people and temptations and things like that. But there'll eventually be some victory gained over that serpentine type power that wants to bring chaos and corruption and confusion into your life. So that's how they would understand it, I imagine. Um, and I don't know that Moses knew more than that himself. Um, he just has this understanding that this is, an important godly message for people to understand.
Thank you so much,
Yeah,
Professor.
yeah,
I
and
do have also another question regarding
okay.
the prophets. The prophets are well known about the Christ or the Messiah.
Mhm.
So why Matthew was quoting uh, the prophets was saying about the Israel? I called
Mhm.
my son from the Egypt, he said.
Yeah.
So that son was Israel. What do we think? Where is a gap that created? Why Matthew he knows Jesus himself partially, and
Mhm.
I was quoting. There is a lot of verses that directly teach or shows. who Jesus was as a Christ, and where the misconception is created, rather than using the exact verse from the prophets. Why he quotes such verses? God had already talked
Mhm,
to the
mhm,
Israel, but he was talking as if that verse
mhm.
as a Jesus, as a Christ.
Yeah. Mhm.
Why is that
Well,
so?
that's the challenge. I would say that, you know, most, if not all of the passages that the New Testament people go back and use and apply to Jesus, that in the context, the psalmist or the prophet, whoever's speaking, isn't really thinking about the Messiah. They they're thinking about something in the salvation history of Israel, some event that's going on. But like Matthew could see this parallel between Jesus, who he believes is the Messiah, and what happened to Israel. Uh, the other New Testament uh, authors, the ones who use the Old Testament, they have a similar perspective, and so they find text that they see as applicable, as spiritually and theologically rich for making application to Jesus in some way. And they aren't always saying that, well, if you go back and you pay close attention, you'll see that the person speaking in the Old Testament had Jesus in mind. Uh, in most cases, they didn't. But what they say and what they talk about happening ends up having in God's providence, it ends up having the ability to be applied to Jesus in a certain way that, again, that fits the first century. And so these things, of course, are all being done in that first century world. Um, and they were doing it in that interpretive mindset that the Old Testament provides us with things that have these abilities to be suggestive about Jesus as the Messiah. And of course, these connections can't be made to just anyone, they only work with Jesus. So that's the argument they're building is um, that Jesus has this unique and multiple ways in which his life ties into the history of Israel. And so if he's not the Messiah, then no one is basically what they're trying to say to their Jewish world. And they're speaking to, Jews in the first century. So they have to speak to them in terms they understand. Um, so that's why um, why it comes across that way and why Matthew is doing this, because that's what his audience needs to see that Jesus is the Messiah.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Mhm. Okay. Okay. Well, let's take a 5-minute break and then we'll continue from there. Okay, are we ready to start going again? Okay, good.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Connected to that, but moving up more towards where we left off, um, and turning to the book of Exodus, when we have the instructions for the Passover that were given in chapter 12. Of course, this Passover has a lot of connections in the New Testament in application to Jesus's death. And the Gospels um, deal with the Last Supper, and that Last Supper was to be commemorated as the Lord's Supper. And that Paul tells us that in 1 Corinthians 11. And also, it's a Passover meal. So, all that builds on this beginning of the Passover celebration back in Exodus. And then in the Psalms, Psalm 34:20, and this has also a connection to what we were just talking about. In Psalm 34, we have this text, which is interpreted as having significance related to Jesus again, just like Hosea 11 and other places. And there, the psalmist is talking about the afflictions of the righteous. And so he's thinking about, people who are following God and trying to do the right thing. And he says that even those people have lots of troubles. It's possible. And but still Yahweh, the Lord, will rescue them from all their troubles. And then he says he keeps all their bones and not one will be broken. And then he turns to unrighteous people, the wicked, and says that the wicked uh, end up dying from what they do, the wicked or evil things they do, um, that brings death to them. And they're the people that hate the righteous, and they will ultimately be condemned in some way. So the this is what sometimes might be referred to as a wisdom psalm, uh, or more specifically, it's a wisdom passage that's in a psalm. But at this point, the psalmist is thinking about how even righteous people are not immune from having difficulties in life, but they can still trust that God will rescue them. But you might think offhand, well, that isn't really true, is it? I mean, a lot of times really good people have problems and their problems don't get solved. They end up um, dying from their problems or being in poverty or being in prison or having all kinds of difficulties. Um, and even when he says that, wicked people will die from what they do, um, and they will be condemned if they hate righteous people. Well, in one sense, this is contrary to wisdom because the wisdom books like Job and Ecclesiastes and even Proverbs, they talk a lot about uh, the fact that there aren't these guarantees, and it puzzles them. And you remember Job's wife, the reason she got so upset and told Job to curse God and die was that she was saying she had this idea that God had promised, a good life if she was good. and she and her husband had been righteous people, and they had lived a good life and tried to obey God, and yet all of a sudden they have all this horrible tragedy. And her understanding is that, now wait a minute, God promised that if we're good, it won't happen. And we were good, and it did happen. So what does that mean? God just can't be trusted. And so that's why she tells her husband, just give up on God. This guy can't be trusted. He tells you he's going to take care of you, and then he doesn't take care of you. And that's wisdom, of course. The texts often deal with this confusion. Why do the righteous suffer? Why do the wicked prosper? Um, Sometimes the wicked don't die from the things they do. They become rich and powerful. So in the wisdom world, they want to know, well, how does this make sense? Because it doesn't seem to fit with other things that are said, that like, if you follow me, then you'll be taken care of and rescued, and if you do wrong, if you sin, then you'll suffer. But it's not ever that black and white in practice, in real life. Um, so that's why we see these different kinds of reflections on what does it mean that righteous people are suffering and wicked people are not suffering. And so in this psalm, the psalmist is recognizing that righteous people do have afflictions. There's no guarantee that they will not, but somehow he expects God to rescue them from them, and then to keep them from being broken. In other words, he won't let them be totally crushed and destroyed. He'll keep their bones intact. He may even, save all their bones from ever having a broken bone. But of course, you can't take a text like this. Well, you can, but you shouldn't take a text like this and and somehow think that Scripture is giving you some kind of promise that if you're a believer, you'll never break your arm or break your leg or something like that. That's, of course, not the point. The point is, though, that God cares for the righteous, and He's there to bring help and rescue, um, which He won't give to those who defy Him. So then He says that, when the wicked do wrong, when they sin, then it can lead to their death. And of course, it can. And that's really the part of the uh, bottom line to the wisdom literature. It's not about promises that if you do good, all will go well, and if you do bad, all will go wrong. It's about the fact that if you're trusting in God, that life can still have difficulties, but if you're living according to God's regulations, then it's going to be a lot less possible that you will have the kinds of problems that people who are breaking God's laws will have. So it's a matter of, that's why it's a matter of wisdom, that the wise person, even though it's not an absolute guarantee that following God will never lead to a problem, the odds are that you're going to have a much more prosperous, a much more um, good and rewarding life if you follow God's ways than if you don't. And for the people that don't, those who are sinners, those who go against God's ways, then it may be that things do go well for them. They may not ever have a big tragedy, but the odds are they will. Uh, the ones that choose, the wicked that choose to live dangerously, then they're more likely to die at an early age, or bring on themselves some kind of uh, really big problem, like being imprisoned or being executed or somehow suffering from their crimes. Uh, so it's really a matter of perspective. It's not that uh, bad things can happen to good people, uh, and that they will always happen to bad people. But the point of wisdom is that if you're a wise person, you'll take the road that has the most possibility and probability to lead to goodness, to lead to prosperity. And if you choose wickedness and crime, then the odds are much higher that you will suffer in ways that you otherwise would not have to. So the psalmist is reflecting on the fact that by following him, there's this much better chance that even though you can have afflictions, you can still rely on God to help you in your afflictions. Whereas the wicked person isn't got the option of God's help because he's not turning to God. And so he makes a kind of hyperbolic statement, just that uh, these righteous people turn to God, and God will take care of them and keep them from being broken. But of course, that's not meant in the absolute sense because lots of righteous people get broken bones. And then by contrast, of course, the wicked do things that bring about their death or their destruction in many cases. So it's that balance and that contrast that he's trying to make. Well, this particular passage in this psalm is used in the New Testament. And John alludes to this and quotes it, showing that the death of Jesus resembled that of the Passover sacrifice in verse 36. And then before that, well, that's in chapter 19, 36. But later on, this passage is quoted. Um, in First Corinthians, Paul talks about Christ being the Passover lamb that sacrificed. And then First Peter talks about that also. Um, and then in the New Testament, this particular statement, just the one statement about not any bones being broken, or that statement's taken out of context. And only that is quoted, not the whole psalm or all these three verses, just that one statement. And it said that certain things occurred so that the scripture would be fulfilled. None of his bones would be broken. And that's applied to Jesus in connection to the fact that it was reality that when he was on the cross, as was often the case, the bones of the crucified or executed person were broken, but Jesus's were not broken. And so again, the reference is made to in John 19 to the fact that scripture's fulfilled because Jesus didn't have broken bones. And he sees a parallel again, just like in this kind of scripture in the Old Testament. And there's a reflection on the fact that God will care for the bones of those who trust him. Uh, this, in a very strict sense, is paralleled by what happens to Jesus, that none of his bones were broken. So again, that's not what the psalmist is thinking about. He's not mentally predicting or consciously predicting or thinking about Jesus at all. But just like with Matthew using Hosea and many other cases, John uh, sees this as an event in Israel's history. Um, in this case, words being used in a psalm that Jesus, as the Messiah, has a connection to. It's an indirect connection, but still, it's one more argument in the whole list of arguments that can be made about how Jesus and things that happen in his life replay things we see in the Hebrew Bible. And so there's another example of how a text is used that way, um, in showing how Jesus reenacts uh, what is in there. And you see, he could even take one half of one verse and cite that and say Jesus fulfills it, and then someone would say, "Oh, but you took it out of context, so it's not legitimate." Well, um, in our world, it wouldn't be legitimate, but in the first century, when Scripture was handled this way routinely, John was just doing what the other Jewish teachers did when they taught about Old Testament passages in the Old Testament or in the Hebrew Bible. Of course, they didn't apply it to Jesus, but they made other types of indirect and um, applicational, spiritual, theological connections. Because again, the emphasis was on how does this text have an application to living in the first century. They weren't concerned so much with what did the author mean uh, contextually. So they were more interested in how later history has a connection. And so John follows that exact same thing when he cites just this one half of one verse. And yet that's legitimate. Uh, Now, also connected to that, um, let's see. Okay, now I'm not finding it for some reason. Um, oh, here it is. I'm not going to talk about all of this, but this PowerPoint is based on this article here where uh, a scholar named Barrett, and he's Jewish, he's a Jewish scholar, and he had this article published and he called it, "Can Scholars Take the Virgin Birth Seriously?" And his argument is and was that you can't be a real scholar if you don't know how to read something in context, because context determines meaning. And so he's arguing that um, you've got these Christian scholars, they try to say that the the Old Testament, specifically Isaiah 7:14, predicts this virgin birth. But then he wants to show how when you look at the context and what Isaiah is saying, that he can't be talking about Jesus, because the child that he's talking about, the Emmanuel child, when you read all of the verses, that Emmanuel child is living in the 8th century BC, because it says that he eats a certain kind of diet, and it's the diet of famine that was brought on by the Assyrian army. So, um, in the context, he would argue that Isaiah has no idea at all about Jesus. So he would say that Matthew, when he quotes it and says that uh, the words that he said support the idea of Jesus's virgin birth, he would say that Matthew is just making the text say what he wants it to say, because it doesn't say that in context. And so his further point is that if anyone who is a true scholar, even any Christian, if he's a true scholar and he reads Isaiah in context, he could not possibly come up with the idea that Isaiah consciously was talking about the virgin birth. So that illustrates what I was showing before, or talking about before, how even though the uh, use of the Hebrew Bible text in these um, indirect and spiritual and symbolic and applicational types of ways out of context, that was, as I've shown, very normal in the first century. But here's a Jewish scholar, and he doesn't, in the whole article, he never even brings that up. It's like he doesn't even know that's a reality to talk about. He's just focused on the fact that Isaiah's context and Hosea's context and all these other so-called messianic prophecy contexts show that the author isn't thinking about Jesus, that shows that Christians, along with Matthew and the New Testament apostles, it shows that we're all just ignoring the context, and we're just making things mean what we want them to mean because we want Jesus to be the Messiah. Well, you see the problem that leads to. It's he's right that that's not in the context, but he's wrong that those passages don't support Jesus as a Messiah, and that they support Jesus as going to Egypt and as being God's son and being born of a virgin and so on and so forth. They just support it in a different way than he wants to think about it. They support it in this way of spiritual theological application, because that was what was going on in the first century. So an argument like that doesn't take anything away from the Christian um, conclusion that Jesus is the Messiah and that Jesus fits what these passages talk about. It's just a technical question of how do you explain how these texts are being used. And it's just fascinating that a Jewish scholar uh, who wants to emphasize context, and it's important to emphasize context, but he thinks that it has to be a contextual interpretation, and it's not. So but because he thinks that, then he can just accuse everyone that has a Christian interpretation of being sneaky and just trying to twist the text to say things they don't say. But they do support those things just in this um, applicational way. Okay, any question before I skip ahead to something new? Okay. All right, I want to move on. Oh, yes, go ahead. Question.
Thank you, teacher, for your explanation.
Uh-huh.
But only the application meaning only gives us Jesus as a Messiah, or the literal, there is no any literal meanings or applications that can give Jesus as a Messiah?
Well, it depends on the text. What I'm trying to show is that a number of texts, like Hosea 11 and so forth, they aren't literally interpreted as, or contextually interpreted as specifically and consciously talking about Jesus as Messiah. Passages that do that literally, of course, are interpreted literally, but many of them are like Hosea 11, where uh, someone like Matthew sees this parallel between Jesus and what's happening in Israel's history and says that there's this parallel between Jesus and between Israel, which is uh, an added reason to conclude that he is the Messiah. And so, in that case, just like Israel went to Egypt, Jesus went to Egypt. And Hosea doesn't have to be thinking about Jesus literally. Uh, the issue there is that Matthew is making a normal uh, spiritual interpretation, as was common in the first century, and he's doing it to his contemporary Jewish people, who are well aware of having Scripture handled this way. Um, so it's not one or the other. It's just a question of which passage we're looking at, and whether the prophet is actually uh, consciously stating something about a future Messiah, or if it's something else. And then the New Testament makes it messianic on the basis of the spiritual application to Jesus. So now moving back to where we kind of left off before, we'll catch up to that and then move on from there. But we were in Exodus. We were talking about the section where Moses descends with the tablets, and there's something about his face that is radiant, or somehow it speaks to the people about his special position as God's agent. And the people were afraid, but he comes down and gives them instructions. And this is where there are some translations, and I mentioned this before, some translations say that he had horns. And of course, first question, is that a correct translation? And if it is, why would it say that? Some translations say he was radiant, and then other translations say he had horns. Um, so why would it say he had horns? Um, and as we mentioned, people in the art world have taken that literally and made statues of Moses with horns on his head and taken it literally. So if it does mean horns, then why would it say horns if it didn't mean that Moses actually had horns on his head, which of course that is highly improbable that that would be the case. So what's it talking about? And likely, again, because what's happening here in Exodus is just developed, from their time in Egypt and interaction with the Pharaoh and Egyptian religion, Egyptian people, and those kinds of things. And in Egypt, the horns of a ram, a male uh, sheep or goat, their horns were often identified with the kings. The kings would have garments or headdresses or something that would have ram's horns on them, and it would uh, symbolize the king's special power and position and his divine status. And so here's an example from, oh, I guess I can't, I thought I could enlarge. Oh, there it is. Okay. Here's an example from the types of things you would see if you go to Egypt or to a museum that has Egyptian statues and memorabilia. I've been to a number of Egyptian museums in the world, and I'm starting to think that there's more artifacts from Egypt outside Egypt than in Egypt. Um, there's still a lot there, especially in this one particular museum in Cairo, but now they've just built a brand new museum, and it's supposed to be the biggest museum pretty much in the world. And it's going to house all the Egyptian things they have in a much more modern setting and so forth. So I'm looking forward to hopefully getting back to Egypt and going to this new museum. But whether you're in a museum in Berlin or you're in a museum in Egypt, or you're just walking around to different cities and seeing ruins and wall reliefs, you'll often see something like this. This is a picture of an Egyptian king, and you'll see that on his headdress here, it might be a little hard to see, but there's a design right here, and that design is the horn of a ram that goes around his ear and around his face. And so this was a typical thing in the Egyptian culture. And so when this text talks about Moses having horns, it's very likely, given the historical and cultural setting, that it's relating to the horns that they would have known from having lived in Egypt. And that the kings had this identification with ram's horns that indicated their deity and their power as representatives of the gods or their divine status. And if Moses came down and something gave this kind of display, then the people would immediately interpret this as, oh, he's wearing ram's horns. He's being identified uh, with God in some way as having divine power and significance, although they wouldn't interpret it to mean that Moses was a god as the Egyptians would, because in their religion, uh, no person was a god, only God was God. That was foundational to the Hebrew religion. Elohim, meaning the one true God, and Yahweh, speaking of him as the eternal one by his name, which of course made all other gods come out as non-gods by comparison. So there could have been some visual issue here where uh, Moses was seen as having this horn, and it would uh, underscore that he is God's representative. And so that's one good historical way of explaining why the text could be correct if you translate it that he had horns rather than that his face was radiant. And this is another good example excuse me, of how interpretation is very much related to not just the words, but all of the contextual issues. You know, when you read these texts in scripture, they're part of literature, but they're also part of history, and they relate to certain times in history and places in history and various people in history with whom the authors of these texts and the Hebrews were acquainted and related to in various ways. So, someone once said that, if you study the Bible, I think a teacher of mine said this when I took a course once on the historical geography of Scripture, which you might think about something like that and go, well, sounds interesting, but I'd rather just study Scripture itself. Um, and how could that be all that related? But the point is that it the historical geography is all about setting everything in its historical, cultural, and geographical context. And when you do that, and this is why archaeology can be so significant, when you do that, it brings lots of things to light that you wouldn't otherwise necessarily know. And when you know these things, they bring the text to life. And so, my teacher at one point said, studying the Bible without understanding the geography is like watching a play with no scenery. And I think that's correct. The geography and a lot of the things about customs and culture, they aren't explained in the margins of the Bible, but they're there as these events are taking place, the things that are being written about. And the people living at that time, that the text is talking about, they were living and experiencing the culture and the geography and the history and all those contexts at the same time. And so all those things have some significance for really understanding as best we can what texts are talking about, because we don't, we aren't living at that time. You have to put yourself back, and this is what we emphasize when we talk about doing, exegesis of text. That is trying to understand what the writer was saying to his audience at that time. You have to put yourself back in that setting as much as you can for the words to make the right sense. Um, Otherwise, they're just words on a page. And if you strip away all the history and the culture and the geography and things like that, then there's a lot bigger chance that you can misread what is intended. So this is a good example where that kind of information helps us perhaps be more um, objective about which translation fits the setting uh, of these words. So the setting is very important as part of the interpretation, as much as we know about it. As much as important as it is to, of course, read the words and read them in their uh, literary context and read them in their original languages. The setting can be very helpful in helping us see what those words are talking about. So that's one illustration of that. We also talked about the tabernacle, and so I was just going to put up this picture just as another visual reminder of what it would have looked like more or less when they had this tabernacle constructed, the way the text talks about it. And so that's kind of a overhead view of what they were dealing with and how it was set up. You see the sacrificial altar out here, and then inside, of course, you have the Holy of Holies for the Ark of the Covenant, the cherubim on top, which the Hebrews, as ancient Near East people, easily understood as ideas of guardians and protectors of places where only certain people like kings could enter and things like that, having God's mercy seat in between them. So that's just kind of one way to visualize this tabernacle. And of course, the Hebrew nation would be camped around in their tents. And as God told them, he also was going to be in a tent and travel with his people. Let's see. Now, I also wanted to go back to areas that we were close to when we left off before, and we had begun to talk some about Leviticus, and specifically, I want to draw your attention to um, a passage, Leviticus 24:10-21, and in that passage we have this story about a Hebrew woman having a son, but the father is Egyptian, um, or sorry, the son is Hebrew, um, and he gets into a fight with another Israelite. And yeah, I think he does have an Egyptian father uh, and a Hebrew mother. But this son of that marriage, he gets into a fight with another Hebrew person. And in that fight, he does something that's viewed as abusing God's name or God's reputation. And so he ended up being judged for it. And it was decided and God decreed that he would have to be stoned to death, that he would have to suffer capital punishment for uh, saying what he said that was so disrespectful to God's character and reputation. And then the text explains that following that, any kind of disrespect for God like this would carry the death penalty. And then the text goes on to talk about punishments that are given for killing or injuring people or killing and injuring animals. But specifically there in Leviticus 24:10-21, um, we're told about what I just said. The son of this mixed marriage, he gets into a fight, and then often translations say things like, uh, during this fight, he blasphemed the name in a curse. And the actual Hebrew text goes like this. It literally says he pierced the name, and then he, well, there's various ways you could translate it. I've translated it minimized. This word kalal, which is the verb used there, it means to treat something like it's insignificant, treat something in a light, meaningless, trivial way. And so the text says that uh, in this fight that he pierces, and the Hebrews even still use this expression. They talk about the sin of piercing God's reputation, of piercing his name, which has to do, of course, with in some way puncturing. It's like if you think of a balloon that's blown up and you stick a pin in it and you puncture it and it deflates and goes flat. It's something like that, that by uh, saying what he said, that made slight of God's reputation, that treated God or talked about God in a way that minimized God's reputation, is like sticking a pin in a balloon. He deflated God's value. He deflated God's importance and significance. So that's really how the text reads more specifically. Um, and But texts often speak about him somehow committing blasphemy and using a curse, which, as we talked about in Exodus 20 and the commandment about uh, not bearing or carrying God's name um, in a proper way. This is somewhat the same idea. The name as typically and often represents someone's reputation. It's not just the name per se. The name is the way to speak about someone's their reputation that they have, who they are, and what they're like. And so in this case, he pierced this reputation. He deflated God. He made God small in some way. And also a few verses later, that's what we read in verse 11 of chapter 24. But when we get down to verse 15, we see another statement similar, but you see here. Um, and let's see. Yeah, there we go. And in that verse, after this happens, and this person who has treated God in a light way, has made light of his character, he's punished with capital punishment. And then first, they come up with a regulation that if anyone, literally the Hebrew says man, and that's just a way to say if any man. But if any man, if any person, of course, in this case, it's not just uh, applied to a male person, although that's primarily in view. But if anyone, and then you get this same verb again, kalal, makes light of something. If anyone makes light of his God by um, lifting up his sin, literally is how it reads. The verse is often translated as something like, anyone who curses God shall bear the sin. Uh, and it's interesting here, this word you see here that's lifted up to carry or bear the sin, as the translation I just read. The person, anyone who minimizes God's value, uh, then he must bear, carry. And it's the same verb that we had back in Exodus 20 about not abusing God's name or his reputation. Here they just use the word God, Elohim. In Exodus 20, they talk about the name per se, which suggests the personal name Yahweh. But here they develop this regulation, and they even use the same verb about lifting or bearing. So anyone that gives he carries around in some way, or bears, or produces um, uh, this situation where he treats God in a very light or insignificant way, then he has to also carry his sin. He has to bear the responsibility for that sin of minimizing, making light of God. And so they use this word kalal here that brings in this idea of making light of God, which also would be uh, something of the mentality back when the commandments were given and people were not to be um, ineffective witnesses about God's reputation. That would be seen, the way you would do that in many ways would be by not witnessing fully to God, but treating him in a way less than he really is. So this goes back to that idea, but now in a different situation, someone has treated God lightly and he's executed for it. And so they say in the future, anyone that does that, he also has to bear his sin in that same way. Then what's also interesting along that same line is going back to Genesis 12, a very famous verse because, it's where um, Abraham is called. And God asked him, we talked about the issues related to him being called to leave where he is there in Haran and head to Canaan. And Abram does this in faith. He does what God asked him to do. He obeys God. And then verse 3 of chapter 12, after God calls him to leave, he has this very well-known statement and says, and it's usually translated something like, I will bless those that bless you, and I will curse those that curse you. And this verse, as you know, has ongoing significance in many ways. And a lot of times it's used to connect to issues about how the Jewish people are treated in history, and even how we think about the Jewish people today and how we relate to them. That's a very complicated question because there's also the question, is modern Israel equivalent to biblical Israel? When you read the blessings about when God brings them back to the land and restores them, those passages describe this new Israel as very spiritual, very righteous, very obedient. It's hard to see how that fits current modern uh, state of Israel. But that's a big subject, and can't say much more about it. But the point is, this verse, of course, is foundational to all these later verses in the Old Testament and the nation of Israel and how we think about these things. But at this point, he tells Abram that, as you leave here and you go off to um, Canaan, he says, I'm going to bless those that bless you. And that probably implies you and, your larger family. But I'm going to curse, but he doesn't really say the same word twice. So it's interesting that translators have decided to say, I'm going to curse those that curse, those who curse you, I will curse. Because before it's the same Hebrew word. I'm going to barak those that barak you. So it's reasonable to say, I'm going to bless you, those that bless you. But in the second part of the statement, he says that anyone who kalals you, I will curse. And that's arar. It's a different word. And this kalal is the same word we were just looking at in those previous verses in Leviticus that has to do with making light of something, who treats something as if it is insignificant. Uh, So when the Leviticus verse and the Deuteronomy or the Exodus 20 verse and even this verse talk about cursing, they don't have in mind uh, particularly the use of curse words, which is often what we think about when we hear something or reading a verse, something about someone making a curse. Um, they aren't really thinking about what we call profanity or curse words. That would be, of course, included in general in what's being prohibited if someone actually used profanity against God, but it's not specifically as we talked about in Exodus 20, the focus isn't on speaking, it's how you live your life and how you deal with issues. And speaking can be part of that, of course, but it isn't just specifically concerned with the words you used and whether they're good or bad words. It's got to do with larger issues than that. So he says, I'm going to bless those that bless you. But if anyone kalaws you, that is, treats you as if you just don't matter, treats you as if you're insignificant, treats you lightly, strips you, deflates you of your worth, then I will curse that person. And then, he's not saying I'm going to kalal them, treat them lightly. He uses a different word. So the translations ought to really switch to a different translation there because he's making a different point. So if anyone treats Abram or Abram's people in a way that strips them of their dignity and value, then God says, I will arar those people. And arar is a very strong word that has to do with a very strong type of punishment. So it doesn't really get the idea across if he just says, I'm going to curse those that curse you. He says, I'm going to severely punish those that treat you as if you're nothing. So that's a very significant verse in the theological history, the salvation history of the Old Testament and how it leads up to the Old Testament. But that's more specifically what it's getting at. Okay. Any question before I move on? If it's okay, I think I'll just continue without another break because there's a lot more I'd like to get done today. But the next thing I want to move to is this episode of the golden calf that comes up, of course, when uh, the Hebrew people are out of Egypt and they get frustrated because Moses seems to have disappeared and may never come back. And we read about them uh, having this situation where they get Aaron to help them construct a golden calf to worship and hope that that calf or that god that the calf represents would deliver them, since they don't have Moses to rely on anymore, apparently, is at least the way they're thinking. So in Exodus 32, we have this passage. Yeah, is there a question?
Yeah, teacher, thank you. I'm following you. I've got a number of insights. Thank you for that. But previously, we have learned that in the hermeneutic course and other courses, God has an intention to create the Hebrew people, which is specifically different from their identity, from their neighbors, and that's why He has given the laws. But as I mean, like that, the writers of the Exodus and the Genesis have taken a number of written, culturally written, and historically from the Egyptian, like cherubs, sphinx, and something. So these things has made me some contradict. Can you give me some clarification?
So what's the specific question? I didn't quite get that.
The writers has taken like cherubs, that the tradition, like
Oh yeah, the cherubs.
Egyptian phoenix, and this is the tradition from the Egyptian. But God has an intention that creating a specifically unique community like Hebrews community. So why that the writer has taken that tradition to write the stories?
Oh, okay. Well, it's the cherubs have this meaning in throughout the ancient world, and the Hebrews are aware of this. And so the Hebrews could make use, or God can make use of those with the Hebrews, simply because they understand the symbolic meaning of them. Of course, they're not thinking of them as a god, and they're not thinking of their king as a god. They don't even have a king yet, but it's just a common cultural motif that they with with which they can relate. And so, they're very much this. Then this is something connected. What you're asking is connected to what I was saying before. That as we're reading through Scripture, it's all taking place in an ancient setting, and all these things are happening in the Hebrews are happening in these different ancient Near East places where the people are very aware. The Hebrews are very aware of, especially at this point, of the Egyptian culture and things in the Egyptian culture. And so God can use these things um, for their symbolic value, because the Hebrews already have association with them. And this is also, um, in terms of what I was just continuing to talk about when we deal with this golden calf. You may think, well, why did they make a golden calf as an idol? What gave them that idea? Well, again, that came straight from the fact that they had just left Egypt, where uh, the calf was, or the cow was worshipped. And some of the gods, or goddesses especially, were associated with this uh, cow animal. So, for example, um, I'll show you a picture here. This bull, or a cow type animal, what's called in their world the apis, was worshipped, and they worshipped a goddess that was connected to this cow, and it was this goddess here, who was called Hathor. And the goddess Hathor, they worshipped in relationship to this uh, uh, sacredness that they gave to cows. Cows were sacred to them because they provided sustenance for life. And so Hathor was worshipped as this god with this sun disk on their head. And so the Hebrews, of course, would have been very well this worshiping of calves. And of course, we find from Egypt many representations of this. Uh, 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 Idols like this were created to represent this bull Apis, and the god Hathor, that was related to this cow god, or this calf god. And they had pictures like this, picturing again this goddess with this sun disk, and she's a bovine type animal. She's a calf or a cow, and gives milk. She, helps people spiritually have spiritual milk, those kind of ideas. And of course, again, the cherub idea, the head of the queen uh, on this goddess who is related to the Apis animal and to Hathor. So here the queen is connected to the goddess Hathor as a sphinx with wings and the body of a cow in this case. So all that was going on in Egypt, and the Hebrews, of course, would have been very aware of it. Here you can see a wall. Uh, I don't know if I can. Yeah, maybe I can. Yeah, I can enlarge it. There you see a drawing on one of their walls, and there's the goddess, and she's feeding this child, and has the sun disk on her head, and so forth. So that would be the goddess. If you if you go to Egypt or a museum and you see a relief like this, and you see this, it's the goddess Hathor, who's represents this cow. And so they also had constructions like this. They could make a calf out of gold. So this calf god they worship would have been like this. So this would have been in the Hebrews' mind. So when they decided they wanted to find another god or some other power to help them, since Moses they thought was not coming back, then they would have easily thought of the Egyptian god like this, and built this kind of golden calf. It's also sometimes we read this story and it sounds like, well, here's all these Hebrew people, and Moses isn't doing what they expect. And um, so all these people rebel and worship an idol. But some people take the approach that actually it's likely, or it very much could be the case, that we're not talking about uh, most of the Hebrew people or all of them. It's possible. Well, there are things in scripture that give some indications, but it's very probable that also Egyptian people left Egypt with the Hebrews. And so as they, traveled on, these Egyptian people, of course, uh, would not be completely compatible with the Hebrew people, but they're traveling with them. And then even, some of the Hebrews, just as we see further in history, they may be more influenced by Egyptian religion and idolatry. And so they're buying in more to that than most of the Hebrew people. So this kind of rebellion could only reflect a certain percentage of the Hebrew people. And it's those people that were the problem and that had to be judged. Um, and so, either way, the Hebrew nation, having just come out of Egypt, would, of course, have been influenced by these things, and that's why most likely that's a golden calf that they decided to build and worship, and hopefully uh, get rescued by having given up on Moses. So that was all very typical of the Egyptian situation, and of course Egypt. The Hebrews had spent a long time in Egypt, so it's natural they would have that kind of connection. Okay, so and so from there, I want to think about the book of Numbers and move ahead to that. Um, the book of Numbers is often not one of the favorite books for people to read. Um, like Leviticus, somewhat sometimes when people are trying to do a read through the Bible thing, they like to kind of just skim quickly over Leviticus and Numbers and move on. But there's some very uh, significant passages in all those books, of course. And people, from the title, people often think, well, why do I want to read a book about just numbering things? And there are some very technical statements in Numbers that have to do with taking censuses and telling you how many numbers of people are involved and things like that. But the focus of the book of Numbers is this first generation of Hebrews. They've come out of Egypt, and they've tried to go to Canaan, but because of what went on with the golden calf and things like that, this generation of people who had been delivered from captivity in Egypt, because of their lack of faith, God decided that they would not be allowed to enter Canaan. They were going to have to um, just travel around in the wilderness outside of Canaan until they died off. And their children, the next generation, they would be the ones that would actually enter into the promised land, and the ones that we would get tribal settlements and start celebrating the national festivals and things like that. So it's just a very significant period in Hebrew history. And this failure of this first generation, and even having experienced the miracles God worked to bring them out of Egypt and to rescue them from the Egyptian army, and then to bring them all the way to where they were. Um, but then they fail by turning to at least some of them turn to a, a calf idol, and then many others, of course, are disobedient in other ways. So this failure then is seen as a kind of a warning, and for future generations. Uh, they had seen all those miracles of God or experienced them, but yet still they were very unfaithful and were punished with not being allowed to enter into the land of Canaan. It had to be the next generation that would go. So after that happens, then the book talks about the boundaries of the promised land, and it talks about the Nazarite vow, and it gives other details about the tabernacle. And this first generation, as it wanders around the desert, and then Numbers talks about these experiences of these wanderings. As they are disobedient, they experience defeat when they should win battle. They don't win the battle because of their disobedience.